Bible students. This is a Sunday evening Bible study. I'm Dr. Renee Milton, and today we're going to talk about Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25. Slaves, in all things, obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. To understand this scripture, you have to understand the culture of the ancient world. In the Greek, Paul uses the term doulos, meaning a person under the command or obligation of another. Sometimes it's translated slave, but in practice, slavery functioned differently than what we've seen in the last few hundred years in the Americas. It's interesting to note Paul's instructions to bondservants. There are some changes that Christianity cannot and will not bring. Paul didn't instruct them to change their station in life or to rebel against their masters, both of which may get them in unnecessary troubles and even death. So Paul encouraged them to obey their masters. Now this is interesting because there is a common theme in the New Testament that I see when it comes to people who have become disciples of Christ. In each case that I've read, rarely was there instruction to a new convert, if ever, to change their vocation or stop what they were doing, except if you count the original 12 disciples when he said, "Come and follow me," and they all left what they were doing and followed Jesus. But in general, if you were not one of the apostles, it's really difficult to find in Scripture where God asked anyone to change their profession. So quickly, let's consider these points. First of all, even soldiers were not commanded to quit the army. In Luke 3:14, when the soldiers who had received the Lord asked John the Baptist what they should do, he simply told them to not take money from anyone by force or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with their wages. Notice he didn't tell them to quit their profession of being a soldier. Many centurions, in fact, are mentioned in the New Testament as Christian, God-fearing men of good character. Notice Matthew 8, verses 5 through 13, and Acts the 10th chapter, verses 1 and 2 about Cornelius, and also tax collecting. Now, Zacchaeus is an example. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector who received Christ, and Jesus did not reprimand him for being a tax collector. And Jesus did not reprimand him about his profession once he vowed to correct his sins. And this can be found in Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. How did the Jews in general view those that were tax collectors? They hated them. The people despised tax collectors because in general what tax collectors would do, they were very dishonest and they would take more money than the regular tax rate. However, when Matthew, the apostle, gave up his position, there was no indication it was because of the profession itself. It was because of God's call to follow Jesus on his journey. And in fact, when he gave a feast, he invited his former associates, other tax collectors. So Zacchaeus, if we go back to him, was a chief tax collector. Jesus never reprimanded him about his profession, but simply required that he be honest, and Zacchaeus knew this and made his promise to give back everything that he had stolen. So in general, the Bible teaches being honest in whatever you're doing. I knew a pastor one time who was shunned by other pastors because they found out he was a police officer. And the assumption was that he had to carry a gun and was in a position to shoot someone. I guess that was the thought of why he should not be a pastor and a police officer. Now, although this may have been true that he carried a gun, it was not a biblical reason at all. Because it sounded more like a weak understanding that, or a personal conviction maybe some people had about this. But there are no scriptures that outline what professions we can and cannot have, as long as we are honest in what we do and how we live. Some professions might be more challenging than others because of the culture of that industry or profession. But that does not mean that as soon as you become a Christian and you're in a profession that might be viewed as dishonest, you need to go and quit your job. God certainly has enough grace to keep us in whatever profession we have. Now back to bondservants. By Roman times, slavery was so extensive in the early Christian period, 1 out of every 2 people was a slave. History records 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. That's a lot of people. And Romans considered it beneath their dignity to work for a living. Well, no wonder they did. All that help around, I ain't doing near a thing with 60 million slaves around. So most of the Romans used their slaves as part of their household. They were considered part of the ancient household. And from 3000 BC and onwards, slaves came from being captives in war. And that was the primary source of Roman slaves. This is very unlike the American institution of slavery, where people of color were marked as slaves based on color and weren't allowed to learn how to read. And the scriptures were used, the Bible scriptures were used to keep slaves in a mental bondage and docile for the purposes of control. I'm sure African Americans listening to this are keenly aware of how scriptures were used. But the Romans didn't have to do all that. They got their slaves fair and square by conquering the entire nation of their country and not going to other countries to trick people into slavery. They simply just conquered the whole country and took the citizens, most of them, as slaves. How can we use these scriptures, though, today? Today, we can use them to get general principles about the employer and employee relationship. So let's go over 4 quick things that we can learn from verses 22 through 25. Number 1, be a trusted employee. Now, the employee position is not the same as a slave, although in some jobs, we can jokingly beg to differ with that. But here we're just talking about an actual employee. Obedience is a pretty strong word to use because you are not a literal slave. You were hired for your capabilities and you are owed money for doing the work that you perform every week. But the general thought is, don't be a problem person on your job. You're not a slave. You are an employee. But if your boss asks you to do something and it's not illegal and it's not bad, just do it. Don't always be the one with something to say back and running the boss down behind his or her back and grumbling about your job. Number 2, consider when you're working that God gave you this job. And if you don't like working here, or don't like your position, still do your work well and do it as if you were doing it in service to the Lord and not to the company you work for. Here, Paul is trying to give them inner peace by giving them a reason to do a good job. Work as though God is watching your work and your attitude, and look beyond the human employer. Number 3, don't do things just for show. And this is a general principle. Paul is trying to get across that we should do our work from the heart and not just do good when the boss is looking over our shoulder. Have a good sense of work ethic and do your job just because you're supposed to do your job and get it done while you're on the clock. In general, do your job. Number 4, here's a general principle. Because a lot of times, people are done wrong on their jobs. Supervisors and bosses are not perfect people, and some don't even know how to manage people and make mistakes that are wrong and offensive. Now, when the Lord tells you to speak up, speak up. We are people of the Spirit and not the letter. So there's no hard and fast rule about how you should do in every situation on your job, except don't sin. But Paul encourages the slaves with the masters, and he tells them, don't worry. Whether you're a slave or a master, you will get back what you put out. And that is the same thing with employers and employees. If an employer does you wrong, don't worry. They will get back what they put out. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. So Paul is basically saying, no matter who you are, whether you're a slave or a master, God is watching what you're doing, and you're going to receive the consequences of what you've done. So don't worry. God has his eye on you and your boss, and everyone gets what they deserve. God will make sure of that. Thanks for joining us today, and God bless you.